So I came to this research when I found myself as a self-employed mother in Australia, and I actually went to the research, being the curious journalist that I am, thinking surely somebody has made sense of this experience in this country and I can understand my own experience in light of someone else's research. And was shocked, surprised to find that it was a vacant space that I could step into. And I think we find often that self-employment is sort of touted as the holy grail for women who are seeking to combine work and motherhood. And we see article after article after article appear. These are actual photos that appeared in the, on the Body and Soul Mums webpage. Thank you, News Limited, for this beautifully hygienic experience of working at home with children. I know I always look at this. But the research on the group is very scant in Australia, where the focus has largely been on women's employment in the organizational context. So I wanted to use my skills as a journalist and as a researcher to find out a bit more about why women in Australia are choosing self-employment and the extent to which are they really? Is this really happening? So I went into the ABS data, and it's true, there is surprisingly little dedicated data on maternal employment status. So the choices that women make about their employment around their maternal status. But we tried to pull together the data as best we can. And we know that as a proportion of the working population, male business owners still outnumber female business owners in Australia. So 12.7% of the working male population are business owners, compared to 8.5% of females in 2012. But as Yolanda mentioned, if we look at the trends over the past 20 years, something startling is revealed. This here is own account workers, that is, people working on their own, either as sole traders or as the sole owner-operator of a listed company. As a proportion, the number of women going into this type of employment has increased nearly 25% over 10 years compared to 1% among men. If we take out this decrease in the number of people, male and female, who are employing other people, we see that there's a consistent, sustained rise of women working on their own in their own businesses, and a fall among men. And if we look at it on a 5-yearly basis, even with the global financial crisis, 2007 to 2012, we see the trend remains unchanged. So women are going into self-employment. And again, if we look at how they're working, we see something startling emerge as well, that these women working on their own account or running their own business are the most likely employed or workers in Australia to be working on a part-time basis. So why are they doing this? Are they doing it because they have children? It's very difficult in the data to pull that out, but if we look at some of the other work that the ABS has done, and we look at business operator status by sex and childcare provision, we see that female business operators appear to be the most likely workers in Australia to be providing childcare on an unpaid basis. Are they mums? Are they mumpreneurs? So why focus on mothers? So in my study, I've chosen to interview women who started their own businesses specifically after having children. And part of the reason I was interested in this is because of this rise of the mumpreneur narrative in the popular media. And incidentally, some women really like that word. They find it very empowering. Why should I have to hide my motherhood status? Why can't I just own it and claim it? Other women find it demeaning. Why do we have to be mumpreneurs and they get to be entrepreneurs? That's a whole PhD dissertation in itself, but I won't go into that. But the other motivation for this study is that there's significant evidence that it's motherhood in particular which carries a particular penalty in the workplace. I think it was Pamela Stone who said, you know, women can be men in a men's world, but there's still a particular penalty for being a mother. And we'll look at some of that research. That there appears to be a penalty in getting a job, finding a job, asking for flex time, and of course, securing equal pay. And I'll just run through some of the recent research in that point by point. So a recent real-world audit by some researchers at Stanford University found that women without children received 2 times as many callbacks for job interviews as equally qualified mothers. So they sent out 600 fake resumes to actual jobs, and on half of them they listed a hobby or an extracurricular activity as a director of a neighborhood association, and the other half were coordinators of a parent-teachers association. And the women who signaled their motherhood status had a consistent limited number of callbacks. And they found also in laboratory experiments that evaluators rated mothers as less competent and committed to paid work than non-mothers, and consequently discriminated against mothers when making hiring and salary decisions. Consistent with our predictions, fathers experienced no such discrimination. In fact, fathers were advantaged over childless men in several ways, being seen as more committed to paid work and being offered higher starting salaries. So finding a job. Secondly, this is some research that was just published a couple of weeks ago, that there also appears to be a penalty in asking for flex time. So researchers from Yale, Harvard, and the University of Texas recruited 76 supervisors under kind of false pretenses, and then asked them to evaluate a series of scenarios. And they found that male workers were significantly more likely than female workers, both among professional and hourly wage earners, to be granted flexible working arrangements for either professional development or family reasons. So the professional women were the ones who thought they were most likely to have their requests granted, but they were among the least likely to have those requests actually found. And their conclusion was that the association between women and motherhood is so strong that even women who have proven themselves by achieving a high status occupation and asking for further career training cannot overcome this actuarial mistrust of women workers. It's important to note these 2 studies have both taken place in a US context, which is a bit different to Australia. To me personally, it highlights the need for this type of empirical research here, because I think it would be very interesting to see if the same type of discrimination is occurring in Australia. So for future researchers out there, these are some questions that I think need to be answered. Also, there appears to be a motherhood penalty in pay, and the existence of this motherhood penalty is well documented in the United States, Britain, and Canada, but it doesn't appear to exist in Sweden and Denmark. Does Australia have a motherhood penalty? And this is an unexplained penalty in wages beyond the 17% pay gap that can't seem to be explained even by time out of the workforce or part-time work schedules. So 2 recent studies suggest that there's an additional unexplained wage penalty of 6% per child, or 5% for the first child and 9% for 2 or more children. This is depressing, but there it is. So what did I do? I put the word out via various forums that I was asking for women who started their businesses after having children to talk to me. And we got inundated with responses. So who are the women who responded? And I've compiled this in a chart, and I've compared it to a benchmark study that was conducted about, 8 years ago now. And we find that the women who responded to our study pretty much align with what we know about women entrepreneurs in Australia. So they're mostly 35 to 54, mostly married or living with a partner, mostly Australian citizens or permanent residents. Most are tertiary qualified, highly educated. The vast majority are sole traders or run micro businesses employing fewer than 5 people, mostly in the service sector, mostly running their businesses between 1 and 5 years. 65% started their businesses with less than $5,000, and they started up using their personal savings or their household income. The only two differences that I found in my sample were that the majority of mine were working part-time. I think that correlates to their motherhood status, and they were mostly the secondary income earner in the household. Again, we were just looking for mothers, not women entrepreneurs generally. So what did they tell me about why they chose self-employment? So for many women, this won't come as a surprise. It was the relative lack of flexibility and autonomy in organizational employment that acted to push them out of formal employment into self-employment. And this quote sums it up. A woman who was a very high-level marketing professional who started her own business after her third child, who said, "I really honestly don't believe I could go out and get a job given my current situation. I don't believe any employer would accept my position and my requirements. I really honestly don't believe an employer would want me." And that was in spite of her last professional formal employment situation being in a so-called employer of choice situation. So the need for flexibility and autonomy based on the stories these women told revolve around three core areas: children, working hours, and the quality of the work. And this quote sums up that interplay. She said, "I kind of wanted to be available for the children, and I didn't feel that my work and the hours required would be flexible enough for me to be available for the kids. And if I returned in a part-time role, and that was all I was really prepared to do, the types of work that I would be able to take on would not be challenging. I wouldn't get the same job satisfaction." So let's talk about the reasons the women cited around children. Again, no big surprises here. So availability of care, particularly in inner city or remote areas, not being able to afford it, especially if they had more than 2 children, and this includes out-of-school hours care. Many women cited a lack of informal care networks if they had no grandparents to call upon or no helpful family, or this was particularly true for the lone mothers out there. Also, childcare and not wanting to use it full-time, although they all took pains to not judge women who do. It was a personal choice. A lot of them talked about the importance of being there and being available to them. And they talked about not wanting to rush, both in a logistical sense, frantically trying to beat traffic to get home for to get to the child care center in time for the pickup, but also metaphorically not wanting to rush that particular point in time. And also being driven by a sense of guilt, that no matter what they did, it was never enough. And I class these as external constraints and internal constraints around children that manifested their decision there. Secondly, they talked about working hours. Again, no surprises, the disconnect with school hours, the logistics and long commutes. But they also talked about this kind of external culture of FaceTime. Even in ostensibly family-friendly employer of choice contexts, there was a real sense among these women of an external pressure to be there, and an internal sense that they were letting people down if they didn't. And these two things comprised to create the 5 o'clock walk of shame, that they just didn't want to walk it anymore. They just didn't want to do it anymore. And lastly, they talked about work quality. So a lot, particularly among my higher achieving women, there was a perception of poor quality part-time jobs, that they could either have the flexibility they needed, or in the case of one woman, they could have a brain-dead job, but they could not have the two, a rewarding job and a flexible job, unless they made it themselves. They wanted a sense of control over what types of work they did and which clients they worked with. They didn't want to take anybody else's bullshit anymore. There's a couple of women talked about that specifically. But they also talked about trading off higher pay for better quality, more meaningful work. And one woman said, "It's a big sacrifice not to be with your kids in many ways, so you want to be doing quality work. You need to be doing something you really like and you feel is really useful. I think it makes the value of the work or the quality of the work matter more." So I look at the motivating factors as a push-pull view, and where these three things intersect is the sweet spot that every woman in my study was attempting to find. And if we look at children and working hours, these things were predominantly constraints on these women, so the lack of flexibility and autonomy, or the explicit and implicit expectations of organizational employment, combined with their own internal sense of what is a good mother, wanting to be perceived as a good mother, feel like a good mother, these factors acted to push women out of formal employment in many cases. And most of the women in my sample, this is important, are earning less now than they were when they were working in formal employment. But they saw the opportunity to create quality work. Whether they chose self-employment because they saw an opportunity or whether they were forced into it because it was the least worst option, they all saw it as a chance to create something that was meaningful. And many of them talked about it as an opportunity to become a role model for their children. If I'm going to be working, I need to be doing something that shows my children that you can do something that matters. So those are the main findings around entrepreneurial motivation and why women, some women in Australia, are choosing self-employment. Mine was a small sample. They were self-selected, so unfortunately it's not necessarily representative, but I think it starts to give us a good starting point for some future empirical research. But some other findings we found through survey data is that 63% of the women in my sample do not make regular contributions to superannuation. And a little bit more alarmingly, 59% have never used the Australian government's superannuation co-contribution scheme, including 30% who were completely unaware of the scheme, even though the majority of the women in the sample were earning below the income threshold in 2012. So they don't know about it, they're not doing it. Even if they know about it, they just don't have the resources to do it. 46% of the respondents did not consider themselves to be entrepreneurs, including women who were running businesses earning more than $100,000 per annum, citing their belief that to claim the title of entrepreneur, one must be an innovator or be doing something risky, and they all cited Richard Branson. His name came up again and again and again. And lastly, about half of the women said they would not consider working for someone else ever again unless it was absolutely necessary to do so, or unless it was something really perfect. But yet they weren't contributing to super and they were earning less than they were earning before. So what are the policy implications of all of this? I think, again, there needs to be legislation, again, to protect women for longer maternity leaves and more guaranteed access to truly flexible working arrangements beyond just early childhood. A number of the women in my study started their businesses when their kids were entering high school because it was precisely at that point that they didn't have access to out-of-school hours care and they felt that their kids needed them more at that point. So this activity was not necessarily tied to having very young children. And also, of course, more affordable access to quality childcare. Those are the usual suspects. We talk about these things all the time. But what about, given that a lot of these women would not return to formal employment even if they got a job offer to do so, what could be done to make their situation better? And a lot of the women said, look, they're flying blind as small business operators. They didn't set out to be entrepreneurs. They don't really understand the reporting requirements, or the reporting requirements feel too onerous given the size of their enterprise. And they said, even the ones that were employing 3 or 4 people said, look, they've gone back to being sole traders because it was all too hard. The reporting requirements were too large for the size of businesses that they were operating and that they wanted to operate. And a lot of them also talked about the need for these kind of flexible business hubs for self-employed people, that the professional isolation of self-employment was one of the hardest parts, and that if they just had somewhere to go during the day to interact with other self-employed people, that would make a big difference to their experience of self-employment. And of course, on-site childcare was something that was mentioned. So to conclude, we often get this picture of self-employment among mothers. The reality maybe looks a little bit more like this. And it's an area we've not really researched much in Australia where we could use some more good research. That's